Next week is era.
Thank you so much. I'm doing
Made them happy.
We did it probably
I'm sorry?
I think this is your master copy. It's signed and not stapled.
Could be, could be. Thank you. That's a
If you have a spare for Alex, because all of the spare.
Good morning, Shabbat Shalom to everybody. Nice to see you. It's so nice to feel the increased buzz in the room. It's been a long time, actually, but so glad that you are starting to come back, and it's really, really nice to just have so many of us together. So, let's see now. First of all, the sign-up sheets, which I think Russell and Nancy have, they're coming around, for bagel sponsorship and so on and so on. Cindy has asked me to pass this out one more time. It's not to pressure anybody, just the more blanks we can fill in, the better. Sponsoring bagels, sponsoring, what else are we doing? Live streaming, and if you're willing to pick up bagels on a given Shabbat morning, Joan Levy will call. So that's being passed around. And once it gets to the end of one table, if you just bring it to the other table. Charlotte?
I see there's a notice there that today's bagels are in honor of Stanley Morgan.
Oh, nice. Oh, very good.
His birthday is,
How great is that? Who sponsors that? I didn't know that.
I think,
What?
how old is Stanley?
So a couple of people have asked me about Stan, who used to sit right here. Stanley's doing well. We just, some of us celebrated Stanley's 98th birthday. and he's living by himself still and has some help and has both his wits all about him and the wisdom that he has is deepening even more. So I'm going to tell Stanley about this being in his honor and that several people have asked about him. Yeah, we just saw him and he's doing remarkably well. So there are a couple of handouts today. This one, which we've been using with barachot at the front, some of you may not have them. I've put some extras right at the end of this table next to Vivian and Malcolm. So those of you who may not have it, come over and get them. I have some more here in case we run out. Just let me know. And I've been passing around this one, which we're going to look at today after a while, from the Jewish Study Bible. And the piece is the canonization of the Bible. Several of you have asked, could we take a look at how the Bible came to be? The process of the sense of importance of a particular book, and it's becoming authoritative in a community, and then it becomes canonized. So this is an interesting piece on that, for which we have too little evidence, but there are a lot of things to say. So we're going to work our way through this a little bit too after we continue with these first sheets. Okay, a lot to do. We have Torah study every Shabbat in October, and in November slightly different, but we'll get to that. Okay, welcome to those who are live streaming. So good to have you. Oh, that reminds me. So some of you have been asking for the handouts. So as I mentioned, who are live streaming. So my assistant Cindy has this first one that we've looked at with barachot, and several people have written to her or to me asking for it, and then she just sends it to you as an attachment to an email. What I'm hoping to be able to do is to put some of these things on our website, so not only can you go to them at your leisure, but you can actually get them before the session. Okay, so I'm sure that's doable. I just don't know how to do it myself, but we're hoping to get it on. Okay, so this is all a work in progress. Anything else I want to talk about? I guess not. Blessing for the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so we've been working our way through these first sheets with barachot at the top of the first page. Let's move to a couple of things we haven't done yet, and that is near the end on page 11 with the top line saying in all capital letters, Ancient Israel. This is an interesting chronology which helps us to place different parts of the Bible historically, and also raising some very interesting questions. So I don't want to go through this in great detail. Herb, you need a copy of that.
Thank you for her.
Okay.
I have
Oh, you
one.
have that. You need
I have
this.
this.
Okay, good. Okay, so you can see that there are four columns: historical periods, biblical characters, Middle Eastern history, what's going on in the larger Middle East while some of these things are happening in ancient Israel, and when the various writings were done. So much of this is speculative, but at least this gives us a broad sense of things. One important addition to the historical periods column, you see along the left margin, the patriarchs, for example, in the year 800, you see that? That should be 1800. So the left margin has been fiddled with. Hebrews in Egypt, 1600, 1500, below that 1400, and so on. And you see the one begins to emerge as we go down the page. So let's just look at some key things here, and maybe you'll have some questions as well. So, biblical characters in the patriarchal period: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. So the first thing to say is this is very speculative. We have no evidence at all that there was an individual named Abraham who did what the Bible says Abraham did. Okay? I don't have any problem calling this fiction, on the assumption that fiction can often give us truths that the facts don't. And in the absence of facts, stories illuminate. We see this. Last week we took a look at an Emily Dickinson poem, Tell All the Truth But Tell It Slant, and looked at the ways in which the gospel parables also tell stories with a certain purpose. And Emily Dickinson would like to also make a case for telling truths indirectly, so that we're not overwhelmed by what the messages are. So the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph, of course, are fundamental to our understanding of biblical religion, how different characters respond to different realities, all of which are part of our own lives. The search for God, the sense of vocation, the impediments that stand in the way of vocation, and so on and so on. So these are stories that tell truths, and each of us will understand what truths are told in different ways, without having to be factual. If we go over just to the right to Middle Eastern history, I want to just point something out to you, so that right under Hammurabi, we have the Hyksos dynasty in Egypt. And one speculation about the Exodus is that the Israelites were a kind of renegade or problematic minority in Egypt, just as the Hyksos were. We have some evidence that there was a group known as the Hyksos, which was much more a sociological entity than a religious entity, and they were expelled, and maybe some scholars would like to speculate this is an echo of Israel in Egypt. We have no evidence that Israel ever was in Egypt, the Israelites. You would think that if 600,000 men over the age of 20, namely a population of 2 million plus people, plus all the supply wagons and animals required for a 40-year sojourn in that area, you would think there would be some artifactual evidence under the ground there. Scholars have found nothing. How improbable is that? So that makes the sojourn in Egypt, which is not to say there's not some Egyptian emphasis, or not emphasis, Egyptian influence. The name of Moses is undoubtedly an Egyptian name, and so on and so on. Influence doesn't mean presence, though. Okay, well, you know, the whole notion of bondage and then liberation is a fundamental, universal narrative from slavery to freedom. And therefore, once again, it's not crucial, at least for me, that it actually happened that way. So we're in the arena here of fiction, of myth, of legend, until we really arrive at something that is historically verifiable. And if we go down the second column, biblical characters, and you see almost near the end of that list, Kingdom of Israel, and then we have the king Omri. You see Omri? So Omri is the founder of a dynasty known sensibly as the Omride dynasty. There are references to Omri in non-biblical texts. I think in the Moabite stele. Well, what does this say to us? One of two things. Either both the Moabite history and the Israelite history are fiction, both made up that name, as impossible as it probably was, or there was a guy named Omri, and he figures not only in biblical history, but also in Moabite history. So this is maybe one of the beginnings of the convergence of the biblical narrative on the actual historical process. So at some point during the biblical narrative, the biblical period, it becomes more and more embedded in history, okay? So if we go back to the Middle Eastern history column, the third from the left, with the Hyksos, I've added in my copy the word Egypt. And above that, I wrote down the word empires. The Israelites dwelt in a variety of empires down through the biblical narrative. The Egyptian empire. The point here is not just that there were empires, but the Israelites resided within them, and therefore had the dual challenge of maintaining their own particular identity over and against a majority culture, and inevitably borrowing from that culture, for better or for worse. Impossible not to borrow, some of which is extremely important to Judaism, and some of it is threatening. Think about, in the last couple of centuries, the role of the Enlightenment to Judaism. The Enlightenment was not a Jewish movement. Voltaire, Condorcet, Immanuel Kant, all of these guys, Rousseau in some way. Well, Reformed Judaism is a response to the Enlightenment. So Reformed Judaism borrowed elements from non-Jewish culture and civilization to its benefit. There is an important essay by Echad Ha'am. Asher Ginsburg was his real name. Echad Ha'am was his pen name, meaning one of the people, Echad Ha'am. And to me, the most important Zionist theoretician. He has an essay with the title, Imitation and Assimilation. And he makes a distinction between two kinds of imitation. Here he's referring to how one, let's say, minority culture borrows from its host majority culture. The first kind of imitation goes something like this. We see in the larger culture something of great value. And therefore we go out and get it and bring it back into our culture and domesticate it for our own needs. The Enlightenment is a good example of this. What would we be without the impact of the Enlightenment? Its optimism, its rationalism, its interest in science, and so on. Even a sort of messianism. The Enlightenment thought of itself as a movement that was going to solve the dilemmas of the human condition through science and technology, let's say, through reason, which vanquishes superstition and so on. So this form of imitation, going out and getting something foreign to us and bringing it back, helps us become stronger. Zionism is really a function of a variety of movements in the 19th century. Nationalism, agrarianism, tilling the soil, and so on. So what would the Jewish people be today had we not borrowed these elements and created our own indigenous movement, Zionism? So for Echad Ha'am, there is a productive form of imitation. We shouldn't be afraid of it in all of its forms. But The other form of imitation is what he calls slavish imitation. We are a bit ashamed of who we are, and we see in the larger culture things that attract us, and we want to be like them. So this form of imitation leads to assimilation. We become part of them and we lose our own particular identity. So for Achad Ha'am, not all forms of imitation lead to assimilation. Precisely the reverse. So what we may see here as well in this chart is the ways in which the ancient Israelites borrowed from host cultures. So what I'd like to point out here in the third column is the empires under which the Israelites in the biblical period lived. First Egypt. Then if we go down that column about 2/3 of the way down to the rise of Assyria, you see that? Okay. Then if we go down a couple of lines, the rise of Babylon. The Babylonians defeated the Assyrians. We lived in Babylonian culture. And then if you go to the back of the page, upper left-hand corner, historical periods, Persian rule, and then Hellenistic rule, begun with the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and so on, you see? So that the ancient Israelites lived within at least 4 different major empires, and obviously were influenced by them. Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, well, maybe 5. Yeah, that's right, Persian and Hellenistic. You know the difference between Hellenic and Hellenistic. The Hellenic period precedes Alexander the Great, and then the period that follows we call the Hellenistic period, because there Alexander spread Hellenism around the known world, from India to I don't know where, the Atlantic Ocean. I can't remember how far west he went. So that is a conventional distinction. Let's go back to the first page. We can see here along the right-hand column some interesting things about when certain writings were written or discovered, not discovered, when they were identified with the period in which they were written, something like that. So we have at the beginning fragments of the Song of Deborah, Judges 5, the blessing of Jacob, and so on. Look over to the left at when these are supposed to have been written. Way before the rise of King David. Fragments from the 13th century before the Common Era. One of the important elements of the ancient Near East is that it's a very dry environment. And so artifacts can survive the environment because wetness, water, destroys elements, especially parchment or things like that. So we have those sorts of things. Then if you go down, we have the famous JEPD. You see it? J, the Yahwist, E, the Elohist. We have J, E, and P a couple of lines down. You see that? This is a so-called evidence from the documentary theory of biblical writing. When were certain parts of the 5 books of Moses written? Okay? And J is given that letter because one of the characteristics of the J document is to use the word Adonai for God. And Adonai in German, if you get Jehovah out of it if you give vowels to it. Yehovah. You see that? Yud, He, Vav, He, which is pronounced Adonai. And if you vocalize it, you get Yehovah. Or in German, Yahweh, spelled with a J. J-E-J-A-W-E-H. And so the J document, the J elements, document is a little strong. So scholars, since Spinoza and Hobbes, have tried to find in the contradictions or conflicts in the Bible, or a variety of themes, what the authors might have been for these writings. It's not that the J document is just plumped into the Bible. It's spread out throughout. So, well, then we go down, let me bring in the Elohist. The Elohist characteristically uses God's name Elohim. The P document, you see J, E, and P. At some point, according to this chart, J and E, J written historically here around the time of Solomon, in what scholars call the Solomonic Enlightenment, a period of enlightenment, when lots of things were written. And then a century later or so, the E document is written. And then J and E down here become combined by an R, a redactor or an editor. Okay? At the same time that this chart says P was written. Well, P was now how to say this? The convention, maybe a generation or two ago, was that P was only written in the exile. So that's after 586. So this chart places P for priestly, not because P uses a certain word characteristically, but now it's who wrote it. Was probably maybe begun before the exile and then enlarged in the exile itself. Let's ask ourselves the following question. Which of these three authors or schools, we don't know whether J is an author or a school. Harold Bloom, the literary critic from Yale, wrote a book, The Book of J. Some of you may have read it, and he makes the claim that J was a woman. Who of these three schools or authors might have written Genesis chapter 1? In the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim, Eit Hashemayim v'Eit Haaretz. In the beginning, God, Elohim. Who might have written chapter 1? E. But how does chapter 1 end? With Shabbat. Who might be interested in seeing the climax of the creation of the world as a ritual, as a holiday? P. So scholars feel that Genesis 1 was written by P. Now if P is much later than J and E, and we have D right below here on the chart, Deuteronomy. D wrote Deuteronomy. An individual, couple of people, a school, right away, at once, over a period of time. It too may have gone through an evolution. D is the last book of the 5 books of Moses, written by a distinctive author. And as we saw last year when we did or 2 years ago, I guess, the Deuteronomic histories, D not only concludes the 5 books of Moses, but it is the assumption text for the histories that follow. What D cared about is elaborated on in Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Where am I going with this? Somewhere. Yeah. Oh, I know what I was going to do. So P comes quite late. What does this tell us about the priestly influence? The Torah, as it was being developed, and we don't know in detail how this was, probably began with chapter 2. Because you have J and E. J probably wrote the 2nd chapter of Genesis. J, according to Bloom, is a huge genius who is not at all beholden to customs. And J does some things which astonish institutional religion, like God was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. What? I mean, God created the world. God runs things from above. He's walking with Adam and Eve in the garden. This is quite surprising. And only an imagination like J could have written this. So the Bible starts with J, because P writes very late. And so P undoubtedly had a kind of proto 5 Books of Moses text and shoved chapter 1 in to be the beginning of the Bible. What used to be chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2, now becomes chapter 2. Because P very late, so the Bible wasn't written in chronological order. An editor like P, in the exile, where there is no longer a king, there are no longer prophets, at least chastising the people, no longer political or cultural autonomy. What is P going to celebrate? What can you do without a state, without a government, without a polity? You can celebrate Shabbat. You can celebrate the holidays anywhere. That's an awfully good way for an author to begin the Bible out of the context of possibilities in which he lived. So this is quite fascinating, isn't it? One problem with the documentary hypothesis is that it naturalizes the Bible. This was written by human beings like you and me in the context of their particular culture and needs. Where's Revelation? Where is Vayomer Adonai El Moshe Lemor? God spoke to Moses saying. So J, E, P, and D was found to be very, very problematic by religious types. Because it makes, and really the origin of this is Spinoza's great comment in the Tractatus. Spinoza died in something like 1677, who said we should study the Bible as we study nature. Laws, tendencies. No scientist goes into the laboratory and comes out by saying, Eureka, I found the solution, I got it by revelation. If a scientist were to say that, this would automatically exclude him or her from the Society of Scientists. Science works only by laws and processes within nature, not beyond nature. And J, E, P, and D are following in the footsteps of Spinoza, trying to figure out in what circumstances, over and against what opportunities and challenges, were these particular things written. Genesis chapter 1, of necessity in the exile, without the accoutrements of autonomy. Okay, so this is all quite fascinating, isn't it? It's not implausible to say that human authors, out of their own needs, were nevertheless inspired by God. So it's not that the documentary hypothesis excludes revelation, it just points to immanent forces behind creation. Gary?
Is there any evidence that P was a committee, some kind of a committee of rabbis who got together?
Well, there weren't rabbis yet.
Rabbis, right.
They were priests. We don't know. I mean, when we turn the page and we see under the last column writings, the fourth element, R, the redactor. The redactor is either a person, a couple of people, a committee in one generation over some generations, who edited all the materials they had and put together the 5 books of Moses. That's R, redactor. Franz Rosenzweig said R shouldn't be named redactor, but Rabbeinu, our rabbi. Because R really gave us Judaism and not just a bunch of documents put together. What's his name? Richard Elliott Friedman, who wrote a wonderful book, but a complicated book, who wrote the Bible. Worth reading. It's a detective story. He's really looking at different pieces of the Bible and trying to infer who may have written them and under what circumstances. Friedman thinks that R is one individual, Ezra, who led the people back. The rabbis say that had the Torah not been given to Moses, it would have been given to Ezra. So it's Ezra in a certain way that gives us the Torah out of the variety of documents and in the dark days of the exile. So it's possible to think, and Richard Elliott Friedman in a way names names. Jeremiah, he thinks, is the author of Deuteronomy, and so on. But that's very speculative. Candy?
I don't know the difference between priests and rabbis.
Right. Well, there's a chronological difference. I mean, rabbis don't come into being until the first century before the Common Era. Hillel and Shammai, I think, are never called rabbis. I'm not sure about that, but I don't think so. So even some of the great sages are not yet called rabbis. Rabbi is teacher. Rabbi comes to, although not at the beginning, run the ritual, whereas the priests are sacrificing, exclusively involved. Not sure I love the word exclusively.
Are they more religious and rabbis more administrative?
I hope not. There are some days, though, that that's true, yeah. No, I think rabbis, look, I think rabbis are more involved in Torah interpretation, traditional rabbis dealing with halakha, law, and its implementation, and doing various inferences for particular cases, and so on. Answer questions. How many times do astronauts lay tefillin in the morning? Irv?
Did rabbis appear after the temple fell? After the temple was destroyed?
Well, no, because the second temple fell in 70 of the Common Era, and the rabbinic movement is well underway, known as the Pharisees, and there were other groups, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and so on. But after the destruction of the temple, the Sadducees were a priestly movement, and they were associated with the temple. So you would think that when the temple was destroyed, the Sadducees would go out of business. They didn't fully go out of business, but they lost their raison d'etre, their reason for being. It's at the time of the destruction of the temple that the Pharisaic movement, one of several in existence then, became preeminent.
And that was rabbinic.
And that was rabbinic.
Uh-huh.
You know, I want to put one word over all these my answers here. To some degree, not 100% certain about every one of the things I've said, but you know, more or less. So the rabbis gain autonomy, and we'll see when we talk about the canonization of the Bible. The destruction of the temple has a lot to do with the final formation of the biblical text out of the welter of texts that existed. So the destruction of the temple is in 70, not the first temple, the second temple, very important for the, what's the word here? Crystallization of the rabbinic movement and the Torah, or the Tanakh, perhaps. Yeah, Malcolm?
A little bit facetiously, did Adam and Eve or Abraham speak Hebrew? Or more seriously, in terms of understanding the source of these texts, are there other ancient languages?
Oh, sure.
That shed light on where these stories or these texts came from?
Yeah, well, there certainly weren't other languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, Ugaritic, and so on. We see the evidence of other cultures on the Bible in a variety of ways. I'm not the person to talk about this, but I can give you one example. We have the so-called wife-sister motif in the patriarchal stories, where Abraham says in two different chapters, 12 and 20, and Isaac in 26, he says to his wife, say that you're my sister and not my wife, so I can be protected. Well, that's a very strange idea. Where does it come from? Well, a scholar whose name is Ephraim Spicer, who wrote, was a great scholar at the University of Pennsylvania a couple of generations ago, who wrote a magnificent commentary in the book of Genesis for the Anchor Bible series. Spicer discovered in a culture known as the Nutsi culture in Syria, northern Syria, something about the wife-sister motif. In that culture, in order to elevate one's wife, you adopted her as your sister. So that the origin of this move comes from outside the Bible. And I think Spicer says something like, but the biblical author forgot the original meaning and used it for his own purposes. So that's a very good example, and I'm sure there are many, many others. I mean, Bilam is a prophet of the Amorites or something like that, who comes from outside, and he is given high acclaim. I mean, he's a guy to whom God speaks. That suggests that prophecy was a common vocation in the ancient world, of which the biblical prophets were just one example. So yes, and the impact of languages, I mean, certainly the late biblical period, the books of Nehemiah, Ezra and Nehemiah, part of it written in Aramaic, which was the language of the ancient world. Jesus spoke Aramaic, for example. And as the biblical period reaches its conclusion, Aramaic becomes much more important. Yeah.
One more point about priests and rabbis.
Yes.
While the temple was still working with all the priests and everything they had there, out in the countryside, there were lots of synagogues where people set up to study the Torah. So maybe the rabbis came from their leader studying Torah there.
I think that's a very, very good point. Certainly, at the time of the Babylonian exile, when the temple no longer existed, scholars believe that this is the time when synagogues were developed. It's a matter of how many. There's only one temple, by definition. Not totally by definition. There was a temple in somewhere in Egypt, I can't remember exactly the name, during the time that the temple stood. So that there's only one temple is probably more ideological than actual, but nevertheless, the ideology of only one temple. When the temple is destroyed, and you need cult centers in order to survive, you'd better change your view of things. There are, by definition, many synagogues. Synagogues, Beit Knesset, the house of gathering, really describes the gathered people than the building. Just like a church, ecclesia as well, is the gathered people. So that synagogues develop in the Babylonian exile, I believe, but only to faint recollection, that scholars believe there were already synagogues in the First Temple period, and probably were. I mean, if you could only make sacrifices by coming to Jerusalem, that would seem to put pressure on distant communities to find other ways to do it. As a matter of fact, Josiah famously destroys, as part of his revolution, the high places everywhere outside of Jerusalem and insists upon the central temple, the one centralization, which is also part of Deuteronomy's program, which is a nice example of the connection between Deuteronomy and the chapters that follow. So, and I think Arthur's making an interesting point, that already we must have either non-Jerusalem priests running the various high places, maybe the Levites, there certainly were Levites out there, or a different kind of leader. You're suggesting maybe even somebody who is doing what rabbis come to do and work with texts. And I think that's plausible. I don't know that we have any evidence for it, but yeah, the pluralization and therefore the need for more leaders, and therefore more kinds of leaders. That's the logic of what you're saying. Jim?
Well, two things. I was going to talk about the chronology, but regarding what Arthur just said, it seems to me the transition, or whatever you want to call it, priestly time, there was a hierarchy. Rabbinic times, at least my understanding, we're all on an equal plane, and to the point that there were rural outposts and so forth, anybody could teach the class, as in now.
We don't pass that around too often.
Okay. But chronologically, okay, so Abraham's called to go to Canaan. So there's obviously some civilization there in Canaan.
Sure.
Okay, then they leave to go to Egypt because there's a famine.
Right.
And then they come back to Canaan to take over. So my point is, with your list here, Canaan, even today, apparently is a very valuable piece of property.
Oh, sure.
So a lot of this that goes on would be seemingly economic or power, because there's always some group trying to occupy that territory.
Right.
And that's got to have a lot to do with this whole thing.
I like that comment very much. I mean, one of the questions might be in general about history is, what's the best way to write history? I mean, do you write it as the development of ideas, or is the animating factor geography? For example, why is it that Britain, until World War II, I believe, never invaded, and therefore didn't have to worry so much about armies and could develop constitutionalism long before any other countries did? That would be a geographic understanding of history. Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier hypothesis as one of the animating impulses of the development of America. Certainly the Civil War is probably one of its important factors in the Civil War is how far west should slavery be extended. Great individuals, maybe economic, maybe geographic, and so on. And you're making the point that we shouldn't think that this development is merely ideas and religion. It has something to do with material questions. And the land of Canaan is the world bridge, really. It's the connecting link between three continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Megiddo in northern Israel, I think this is right, archaeologists have dug up something like 18 different civilizations under Megiddo. So long before the Israelites got there, that land was occupied. And you know, this is along the coastline, so that it's not in the mountain region. So if armies need to go from Egypt to Asia and so on, that would be the route on which armies traveled. So fortifying, claiming that territory gave you a great deal of power. So I think you're absolutely right. Geography, economics, sociology, crucial factors. It's a very important question about how best to write history. What are the forces which have causal impact on the unfolding of data? The answer is obviously many, if not all of them, but historians focus on one or another's often.
If you look at a map prior to the Suez Canal, you can see exactly what you're saying, that the
Yeah.
and I mean, what a great way to take over the property. You gotta get out of here, God told us to take it. And other groups do the same thing.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. What did they say? That the land of Israel is the twice promised land? I mean, Christians, I don't think, claim it as it's not. Muslims and Jews think of it as the land of Israel. I think Christians think of it as a place where the important moments in the career of Jesus took place. It's not the land itself is sacred, but it's that particular places are themselves. Yeah, that's a good point about the Suez Canal. If an army in Italy wants to get to India, how did it do it? Either over land or it went all the way around Africa in order to get there. The Suez Canal cut the time. One more thing on this, and then I'll see if there's some things you want to talk about. On the back of on the back of this page, we see the last item under the fourth column, Daniel. Daniel's a prophet. You see, though, that Daniel is written way into the Hellenistic period. And therefore, that tells us why the book of Daniel isn't in the section of the Bible where Daniel should be, in the Nevi'im, in the prophets. Daniel is in the writings. And the reason is that, I mean, we can make this inference, and there's some other evidence for it, that the prophetic corpus was completed by 200 or so on the Common Era, and therefore nothing else could get into that section of the Bible. That's what canonization means. What's included is there forever, and what is not there is not there forever. Daniel came too late, and therefore couldn't have been placed in the section where, according to content, Daniel belongs. So the book of Daniel is an illustration of something about the history of the development of the biblical text. Anything else interest you in these sheets? They're very illuminating, aren't they, this whole series of things? Okay, so let's go to page 13. Just take a little look at this, I think, interesting list about what makes a text authoritative, or to put it differently, what is authoritative of the biblical text? What's the authority of the biblical text? And Alter, in this interesting book, Canon and Creativity, gives us, according to my count, 10 different possibilities. I divide them into two different categories: community and content. So number one is community. It can be, this is not, it always is or must be, a mechanism of ideological coercion and conformity. And Scripture is often used that way, right? This is what you must do, this is what you must believe in order to be part of this community. And in my own writing, I put here, there's an assumption behind number one. And that is that the biblical text is, in some significant degree, a coherent and internally consistent text. At least it can be given coherence and consistency. Because if it's an instrument of coercion and conformity, you must be able to say with authority what the text says. And if you're going to do that, you don't bring up the following idea, that there's a conflict between what Deuteronomy says and what the book of Job says. As soon as I say that, it weakens the claim that this is the text that I must devote myself to. I'm not going to devote myself to a text that is full of contradictions. What am I devoting myself to? So number one seems to assume consistency and coherence. Well, since the Bible is neither consistent nor internally coherent, we have to develop another idea. The Bible within the Bible. What is it that we're going to be focusing on in order to tell us what the Bible is? I mean, if you've ever spent any time with these television preachers who are quoting the Bible, they only quote a very narrow subset of texts. They're not going to start at the beginning and read right through it, right? Genesis 1, animals before human beings. Genesis 2, human beings before animals. You better not read that if you want people to feel that we're devoted to this text, because contradictions explode theories, don't they? Number 2, I think, has to do with content. And I love this comment. Harold Bloom. It's strange. This is the content of the Bible, how we can describe it. Its strangeness, its originality, its power to make us see the world in new and surprising ways. The Bible is a text that opens our eyes to new ways of seeing the world. And so in this sense, it's extraordinarily fertile for different understandings of things. Look, when you think, say, of the New Testament, Reformations are essentially back to Paul movements. Because Paul, in some ways, was a renegade. He claims never to have known Jesus. He has his own views, develops sacramental ideas. So as the church develops its organization and becomes more, say, top-heavy, we're about to see some reformation coming along of back to the Gospels. So the Bible can be used, I'm using the New Testament as an example, as not only an instrument of conformity, but as an instrument of revolt. If you focus on certain texts, which in a way explode the claim that it's coherent and consistent. 1 and 2 are in some conflict with one another, both, according to Alter, being meanings of canon. Number 2 is canonical in the sense that I'm going to take it very seriously, and I'm going to read it on my own and not through the prism of institutional understanding. The Bible is a revolutionary text waiting to be brought to life, according to number 2. And it is, actually. What is the Bible? It's law. The 5 books of Moses is law. And, if you want to be a good Bible reader, believer, you'll follow the halakha. That's the Orthodox reading of it. The Reform reading of it is, no, the center of the Tanakh is not law, it's prophets. The Bible is essentially about the prophetic revolution. The conservative movement, this takes some arguing, focuses on neither law, it has certainly an emphasis on law and prophets, but on the history of the people. Right? I mean, there's a famous essay by Achad Am. It's not that Moses created Judaism, it's that Judaism created Moses. And we use historical individuals to understand who we are. Number 3 is community again. It offers enlivening occasions for continuity. This is an interesting idea, isn't it? A text gives continuity to a community. We all go back to the same text, however differently we might read it. An approved list of authoritative works. This is focusing on canonization. Certain works are. Number 5. It enshrines doctrines or truths in a text. And that's another way of seeing canon, that it tells us the truths that are true, period, and down through time and all the changes in history. It provides institutional and communal cohesiveness, so that's parallel to number 3, isn't it? Focus on its communal implications. 7. In its complexity and internal tensions, it provides flexibility for ongoing interpretation and application. This is wonderful. I mean, one can think of a text as closing down the conversation. This is what we're going to talk about, just what's there, and it's one conversation. Number 7 is the opposite. This is a text that opens up conversations. And that if we focus on Deuteronomy, we're going to get one understanding. If we focus on Job, we're going to get another. If we focus on Genesis, in the beginning, God created heaven and the earth, or this passage in Samuel, God never changes his mind. Austere, sublime, master of the universe, a worthy object of prayer. And then you get to the Psalms, one of which, I think Psalm 42, says, wake up. Why are you sleeping, God? We are suffering. This is a very different understanding of God, who can be contended with, who in a way, not in a way, who is sleeping on the job. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God said, let there be light. And God said, let this, and it was so. And God said, that's so. That's the austere God, who never nodded, who never sleeps, who never is indifferent. Whereas the Psalms, so if we become enamored of a certain view of God as transcendent, as beyond the comings and goings of history, and then we happen to read Psalm 42 or Job, we've got a totally new idea. And of course, Psalms is in the Bible, so it has authority. It's not Thomas Hobbes. Oh, you read a wonderful point in Thomas Hobbes. Yeah, but what's the authority of Thomas Hobbes? As opposed to what's the authority of Psalm 42? A lot. It's in the Bible. Number 8, an embracing archetypal pattern for the representation of human life. I like that. The Bible as worldview. How to understand our place in the world that the Bible creates for us. Number 9, canons must possess an intimate relationship to their readers while being powerful enough to guide that experience. I love that as well. That this is about relevance. The Bible has to be, a canon has to be relevant down through history. And the Bible has been. I mean, it's not the only text that is. But one of the remarkable things about the biblical canon, the New Testament canon, the Quran, not just the Hebrew Scriptures, is that it speaks to one generation after another, maybe in different ways. So this is a remarkable thing about an ancient text, that it continues to speak to us. I mean, Homer does too, right? Aeschylus does too. This is not a uniqueness claim that only the Bible, but something about the Bible which is quite, I think, remarkable. I love number 10. A canon is above all a trans-historical textual community. Knowledge of the received texts and recourse to them constitute the community. But the texts do not have a single authoritative meaning, however much the established spokesman for the canon at any given moment may claim that this is the case. We've talked a bit over the years about, some of you have talked about, the power grab of the priests or of the prophets. In other words, what's their authority? They want to be in charge of things. The rabbis want to be in charge of things. So one could imagine a group trying to take control of the meaning of the Bible. But this number 10 says at the end of line 2, but the texts do not have a single authoritative meaning, however much the established spokesman for the canon at any given moment may claim that this is the case. In our Torah portion for last week, which is Nitzavim, which we're going to read on Yom Kippur, you are standing here to this day before the Lord your God. The men, the women, the children, the hewers of wood, and the drawers of water. This is a understanding of community which puts men and women on the same level. Men and women and children and so on. Well, the rabbis engage in a hierarchical understanding that men have many more obligations than women, the men run things, and so on. That text in Nitzavim is waiting to be tapped by a feminist movement, just to put it this way. Wait a minute. Does the Bible? Yes, all the prophets are men except for a couple. Yes, all the kings are men. The main players are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Moses, and Aaron, and David, and Solomon, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Yeah, it is patriarchal through and through. But there are some passages, if you want to shine a light on them, which can give rise to another understanding of the sociology of the Jewish community. And that's what he is saying here. That however much the established spokesman for the canon at any given moment may claim that this is the case, after all, the Bible in a way is like a tinderbox, like, what do you call that wood? The kindling wood, which is waiting to be ignited by somebody's imagination. And then, so, in a sense, the Bible is both actual and potential. It's filled with potential that has not ever fully been realized. Don't you think that's true? After all, even within the community of traditional believers, the biblical canon has been imagined to endorse, as a matter of divine revelation, the following isms: rationalism, mysticism, nationalism, universalism, asceticism, sensualism, determinism, free will, and a good deal else. The Bible has been used to underline the power of these different ways of understanding the world. A canon is a dynamic, trans-historical textual community and not a timeless inscription of fixed meanings. How great is that? Any comments about this page? I find it a very exciting page because it opens up what can be understood as making a text authoritative. And along a spectrum from full consistency and conformity to full potential waiting to be kindled by a lively imagination. Malcolm?
Does the contemporary seminary, the Hebrew Union College of the Reform movement, adopt a particular perspective around this, given that your education as a rabbi, it would seem to me, needs to be framed or guided by one of these perspectives, and these are not all harmonious with one another.
Right, for sure. So Malcolm is asking, I keep forgetting to repeat the question, whether the Hebrew Union College Rabbinical School that I attended, Rabbi Cohn, we all attended, is paying attention or focusing on, I think you're saying, this variety of possibilities. Is that your point?
In other words, how do you learn the text?
Right.
Through what lens? 'Cause
Right.
these are all different ways to think about the scripture.
Right. Well, it's been a long time since I studied there. Let me try it. And I don't know what's going on now. I mean, I do know there's been a lot of changes, for example, in the whole pastoral element of the rabbi. In my day, it was given very little attention because most of the teachers were all PhD rabbis who were, in a sense, fleeing the congregation. So the focus was on academic scholarship, more or less. Wissenschaft des Judentums, the science of Judaism. Now, the move has gone very much toward an emphasis on the pastoral, right? I never knew how to conduct a wedding until I was standing under the chuppah for the first time. How can I answer that question? I think, one can see rabbinical school as parallel to law school, I think. Are lawyers, once they have graduated, fully ready to be lawyers? in a way, and I think rabbinical school, as I just said, I don't think I was well prepared by rabbinical school to do what I do. I think what these professional schools do at their best is, this is an echo from my Rosh Hashanah morning sermon, is they create desire. They create the desire to learn, the desire to develop yourself. They give you some of the resources for engaging in what desire leads us to. But I think certainly there was not conformity imposed upon us. In a way, it was very much an academic institution. We studied Hebrew grammar, we studied Bible, we did Midrash, we did Maimonides, we did modern Jewish thought. What is this? It's a smorgasbord. And each of us takes, according to his or her predilections, what path we want to follow, or paths. I mean, it is 5 years, but, I've been doing this sort of thing for decades, and I used to say to my roommate in college, there's so many gaps in my education. I feel the more I've learned, the larger the gaps. So if you have the desire, that can really generate what we in one way ought to be. Yeah. Patty?
Can I offer a personal perspective on the list that you just read?
Good.
I like 7 and 10
Mm-hmm.
best, and I would say those two are what keep me coming here.
Yeah.
I know I'm rather new here, only 17 years. Most of you have been coming longer.
Yes.
And I have, but the conversations that are ignited by the text on a weekly basis have just been so rich and meaningful over time, and allowed us to get to know each other as a community here. It's just been a vehicle for our community.
Yeah. Great.
And 10, I like the fact that, having grown up Catholic, I wasn't really allowed to read the Bible. Not that we were forbidden, but the priest made it pretty clear that they would select the passages that we would be spoon-fed the interpretations. And my experience with Judaism and what really prompted conversion was that I was allowed to and encouraged to, maybe even obligated to wrestle with this text
Yeah.
and its contradictions and the things that I totally disagree that are within it. And that has been, that's been meaningful, that it's part of our culture so deeply, and to be able to get to know these stories and the whole chronology of the Bible so well over time, that I see it just repeated everywhere. And all the art forms that I love, I feel like I have a much more a rich experience in our culture because of this shared document amongst Christian and Jews. You
Well,
see it everywhere.
That's a powerful statement, Patty. I just love it. So you've done two things, I think. One is you've personalized this list. These are the items that you really resonate with, and they have allowed all the things you've said they allow. Yeah, I love that. And in a way, I'm inferring, you weren't implying, I don't think, that each of us might want to go back to this list and see which item or items really captures our understanding. You're talking about the clergy of your growing up had a certain view. I take it number one was very important to them, and the institutional thing was very important to them. Conformity. Yeah. Ours is a community of learners and aspirers, not necessarily a community of well-established doctrines and dogmas, and we're here we're here to reinforce them. There's power in that as well, because in a certain way, the community, maybe you won't agree with this, I'm not sure I will, but I'll say it anyway. The force is really centrifugal. I mean, we get an idea and we expound it, and we go in different directions. The institutional one is much more centripetal. It pulls things together, and there is a well-understood sense of who we are as a community. I think for us, our community is this fundamental text on which we write our own script, so to speak. What do we believe about X, Y, and Z? And the community is formed by the energy of the conversation, and as you nicely point out, how we come together as a community. I mean, the question that a couple of you asked when I came in, and we asked it right here, how is Stanley Morgenstern? That's a function of this community, that we care about one another and one another's well-being. You know, there's this idea in Rabbinic Judaism where the rabbi says to his students, didn't you know that Plony was sick? How can we be studying Torah together and not know what is going on in the lives of the members of the community? I mean, it's a little harder now since we're all out and about in different ways, but it's an interesting point. I mean, the obligation is not only to try to understand a text as we do, but care about each other. I like that very, very much. Sid?
So Patty may not have realized it, but she may be the person I do need to talk to. So we're talking about canons, and as a nice Jewish boy and reading admittedly limited Catholic literature, are we saying, for example, canon law, as the Catholics understand it,
Yes.
as a nice Jewish boy from the outside looking in, would say it's more arbitrary?
What's more arbitrary?
Canon law.
Oh.
Would be the thing. I'll use language, again, this is a gross simplification, the expression that I heard during my military service, you will do this and you will like it.
So it's not arbitrary.
You're doing it, period. If you want to be a good Catholic, you will do this.
Right. You know, what comes to my mind is a kind of continuum of community. There's certainly the military, and the fact that every soldier wears the same uniform has a great impact on the formation of this kind of community. They're all wearing the same thing, and by doing it, their individuality, their differences as individuals becomes recessive, becomes muted. So that's a community of conformity. When they march down the parade grounds, they're as one. A hierarchical understanding of community is very crucial for the military. You know, here we are, we're facing the enemy. You guys do what you want. I'm going to step back. No, there's a hierarchy of authority, and that authority needs to be followed. Maybe a caricature, certainly of modern Catholicism, I think would be similar to that. On the other end of the spectrum is each individual wearing what, as a metaphor, what he or she wants to wear. And what you do is up to you, and in some communal sense, arbitrary. What are you asking, Sid? Where is Judaism on this continuum?
No, I'm asking, am I understanding canon law as it is explained by Catholics or any other sect of Christianity that uses canon law and saying, these are the rules,
Yeah,
don't go outside the line?
yeah.
But they require interpretation also.
I'm sorry?
They require interpretation.
Yeah.
Vatican has people.
Right, Irv is adding to this. I mean, first of all, I know almost nothing about canon law,
Okay.
and therefore I'm not in a position to do it, but to answer that question. But I think Irv's making an important addition to this conversation. Can a living community live over time with only one interpretation of a set of texts or rules? Isn't somebody at some point going to say, why? Or, wait a minute, I read it a different way. Isn't it very hard? unless you've got something like a mathematical proof, I suppose even that. Yike. Yeah. So I would say, in some formal sense, not knowing anything about canon law, that there are communities which tend toward uniformity and following the laws to the letter, tends to, because human beings don't sit real easily without a lot of sanctions. You step out of line, you're going to be, and so on.
Would that sort of be like and I'm going to use the wrong expression, the most stringent Orthodox Jews, the most fundamentalist Orthodox Jews? You do it this way or else.
Yeah.
The story I like to tell people is, at one point in my daughter's life, she was dating a gentleman who was going through medical school and then working in a hospital, and he came across an Orthodox Jew who said, "There is no way that your girlfriend is Jewish, simply because she was brought up as a Reformed Jew."
Yeah.
Period.
Look, who am I to speak for the Orthodox world?
Okay.
Part one. Part two, I'm going to do it. How do you hold the lulav and the etrog? You hold it the way the tradition says to hold it, for crying out loud. You do it this way and not this way. There is a level of, you don't eat pork. So there is, I'm thinking of a kind of continuum again. There is a whole set of what we might call behaviors that are mandated. I imagine, without knowing, that different communities enact different levels of stringency. On the other hand, as you move up that continuum, maybe up is the wrong metaphor, certain questions become much more complicated. Issues of medical ethics. Is it ever valid to take the life of a person at certain stages of life? Is euthanasia possible? I think the Orthodox world, I kind of agree with this one myself, is that active euthanasia, actually killing, giving a dose of lethal injection. Of course, there's the whole notion of secondary effects. I give the injection in order to soothe pain, and as a secondary effect, it kills the person. I didn't intend it. Active euthanasia, but there's passive euthanasia, allowing nature to take its course. Well, this is ambiguous. And I think different Orthodox sages understand the limits of passive euthanasia differently. So we do have, both in the Reform world, which we would expect, but even in the Orthodox world, the strict Orthodox world, a genre of literature known as responsa, she'elot and teshuvot. Questions are asked of a rabbi. He says, I don't know. Let me look at the text and see what I can come up with. I'll tell you an anecdote from my own life. I've told it before. Some of you have heard it. So I was preparing to conduct a wedding many, many years ago with an Orthodox rabbi. So we were at the rehearsal, and a question arose. The two rabbis answered that question in two different ways. I said, here's what we ought to do. The Orthodox rabbi said, let me call my rabbi. So we paused for the rehearsal, and he went into the office. Maybe it was his, maybe it was another rabbi. And he called his rabbi in New York. For all I know, that rabbi, having gotten this question, said, let me call my rabbi. The more difficult the question, the more possibilities there are, the more the authority of the rabbi needs to be located. And humility, I think, is a part of this system. Where, look, if I don't fully understand how to answer, I'm going to try to be very honest about it. If I have a preference and my intuition and experience lead me to feel there is an answer, I'll give it. I'm humble about it up to a point. At some point I feel I can give an answer. I think so. Humility. Less humility. More self-confidence. This is where I am. The rabbi that I did this rehearsal with, his humility continues on to higher and higher levels of understanding until he has to go. And finally, they go to Joseph Soloveitchik, Alav Sholem, right? Or Moshe Feinstein. Finally, you're going to go to the person. If the level of complexity is so great that none of those on the lower realm and the be on the low realm is to be very high. So there is openness and ambiguity in the Orthodox world, but not at the level of how many cups of wine. Should there be an orange on the Seder table? No. No. Yes. I mean, so there are arenas in which there are answers. But I think we caricature the Orthodox world if we don't recognize a great sophistication animated at least by two things. A recognition of complexity and a recognition that these questions need to be answered in a credible way. So, I don't know about canon law, but I know the halakha. You know, there are codes. Which shoelace do you tie first in the morning? No. On this, there's no ambiguity. But whether or not Jewish astronauts should lay tefillin, and when, there's no answer to this question in the sources. But if a Jewish astronaut asks you, what should I do? Because I'm a halachic Jew. In other words, if I ask the question, what do I care? If I lay tefillin over India or over Alaska? But if I need to do it in the morning, then I need to know what counts as morning here. Because I have an obligation to lay tefillin. I don't have an obligation to lay tefillin, as I understand. So if I can't, I won't. Stuart.
Your analogy to law school reminded me. In law school, we are taught not the practice of law, but how to think like a lawyer.
There you go.
I was totally unprepared to write a complaint, to officiate at a wedding, or do any of the matters that a lawyer thinks are part of the practice of law. Yeah. And I'm sure when you graduated from rabbinic college, you were totally unprepared, but you worked to develop those theories, those practices that enabled you to become a rabbi.
In your language, I learned how to think like a rabbi,
Yes.
how to go about. That's an elegant way of putting it. Appreciate that very much. Yeah. No, that's really true. Is it true about graduate school as well? Yeah. Yeah, it probably is. You learn how to think like a whatever. Yeah. I want to be sure. Irv.
No, medical school I've always thought of as pre-medical school, because when you're an intern or resident, that's when you really learn how to do it.
Yeah, right. So these are all preparations for the professions. Yeah. Jim, and Michael.
What surprised me was your love for music, including orchestra. You did not bring example they suppress.
It's a good point. And
My next question to you is, what is different between canonization,
yeah,
dogma,
yeah.
and dialect?
And dialectic?
Yes.
Oh,
What is canon suppress or promote? Is it canon by itself, by nature,
Oh,
in
yeah.
foundation, has this spark which will cause eventual explosion, which will destroy everything what is created?
I'm not sure I followed the last thing. Will,
Well, canon, in essence, in a foundation of itself, contains a spark which will cause explosion and destruction on everything that's created.
Yeah.
So, but everything that is built on this.
right. Well, I think Michael's making an interesting point. Does the, and this was not your word, the rigidity of canon itself create the seeds of its own demise? Too rigid. I mean, think about scientific theories. Think about Aristotle's astronomy with the difference between the laws of terrestrial science, how things work on Earth, essentially rectilinear, and how they work in the realm of the heavens, essentially circular. So Aristotle saw two different kinds of existence, in his language, the level below the moon and the level above the moon. Well, Aristotle held sway for 2,000 years, and anomalies began to pile up against Aristotelian science. But so much was the authority of Aristotle, we might call it rigidity, that the scientific revolution actually was delayed. I mean, in the 4th century, some guy whose name was John Philoponus saw a big problem with Aristotelian physics, but so rigid was his authority. But eventually, some of you have read, what's his name's, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn. Yeah, right, Kuhn, yeah. And Kuhn talks about normal science, the development of anomaly, more anomaly, until the paradigm explodes and a new paradigm is formed. And in science, there can be that rigidity about a particular authority, so to speak. You know, your example of the orchestra. Some conductors are tyrants. George Zell was one of them. And Bob Zupnik of blessed memory, who played the oboe in the orchestra for decades, told me often about individuals who raised a question. One guy raised his hand during rehearsal and said, "I think it should be this way." And yeah, you know these stories as well. And George L. said, "You're excused. Go to the executive director, get your pay. You're done." There have been soloists, people with soloist impulses, who have finally found it impossible to remain with the orchestra. So, but there can be conductors who are collegial. I suppose eventually, you know, you can't. Let's all play Mahler the way we feel like it. You know, I don't know if any of you saw, by the way, just as an aside, the performance of the Resurrection Symphony last couple of. There was a moment in that symphony when 100 instruments ended together on a very fast paced ending, and the silence was just astonishing because they were all together. You've got to have not only superb musicians, but willing to follow what the conductor wants. Yeah, so that's a good example. Again, it's a spectrum, isn't it? It's one of the reasons why chamber music is so wonderful, because it's a collaboration among the different instrumentalists. And I'm sure they have their arguments, don't you think, about how something should be played? Yeah. Well, my my goodness gracious. Try to bring this sheet, packet, which we didn't get to this week. Next week I'll have more. We'll spend a little time on canonization. I want to also, get back to reading the Bible as well. But I think that these discussions are very, very rich. So let's continue. Those who are fasting on Yom Kippur, I hope you have an easy fast and a wonderful conclusion to these 10 days of repentance. And Happy New Year, and I'll look forward to seeing you soon. Shabbat Shalom. That was great. That's what professional schools, 3 years is also 5 years.
As the same as my master's in history. I think like in this story, not be an historian.
That's nice.
Yeah.
That he shared them with you.
Science method. Of today's, of this?
Yeah, for Toby. I'll deliver it to Toby.
Oh, good. Oh, great. How are you?
Great, no complaints.
Good. That's the spirit. Everything is good. Yeah. Who wouldn't want to live the life I live?
Huh?
Who wouldn't want to live the life I live?
I don't know, I think it's magnificent.
Well, oh my gosh, I feel like the luckiest person in the world.
I have no complaints.
Good. There are things to complain about, but who
What's the
wants to?
point?
What's the point? And it just takes some of our limited energy, which should be on other positive things.
I'm very happy with the role I stuck with.
Isn't that great? Not everybody can say that. You too. That's a lovely comment.
Many there's so many pages.
But it was interesting that all these spiritual versus this materialistic, he did the mix.
My kids would never like spiritualists. They would hate that,
I am partially agree with Michael because
Finally!
partially no, because look in physics we will never get the book which we are not going to change. Aristotle, Newton after 400 years, Einstein for 100 years. Now we're changing that. Of course, it doesn't work. It's quantum mechanics. So in physics, the kids we will never teach them based on the Aristotle physics. Never. But we do it with dogma. I call it the Bible. So somebody in 300 BC decided it's a canon. Okay, so is the physics and the human being behavior is completely different. Is people believe that human beings in 2,000 years they don't change, so we don't have to update Bible and tell something new, or only physics change because we are limited, we're just learning all the time, or like we know that, or like this opium for the human beings, meaning 300 BC rabbis or priests, they decided we would like to rule over the majority of the human beings, and that's a canon which we cannot accept as the scientists.
Well, fortunately, we do have a fixed text, but we also have the oral Torah, which continues to remake the canon in a way.
But still,
how we understand it is responsive in some way to our needs.
And partially canon Torah was created for one and one purpose only, main one, to let
Keep the
Rabbi
human beings.
have easy life.
Yes,
And that's
exactly.
reading.
That's I agree.
Very good.
And
Don't
to
tell
keep us,
everybody that.
No, somebody
and to
told
keep
me
us in their
anecdote
pockets, right?
as a student of yeshiva approach to his teacher, Rabbi, and Rabbi, I'm planning life.
Kathy, don't go. I'm coming.
I would like to go learn about stock market. Where should I go?
Yes, yeah.
There's a store in front of you. Go there. 7 years good, 7 years skinny.
Very good, very good.
Have a good
Lovely.
one.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks.
Always good.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. You know about it, that's why you never worry. I don't know.
Is your place still in existence?
Give us your order. So we'll check it out for you. Chris, we're done first. Yeah. Talk to the boss. Yeah. Delivery.
And we accept tips. Yes.
Oh, no.
Which I don't have.
We don't know how to take it.
And if you don't, I always heard your
Hi. Hello. I have a hand story to tell you.
Oh, good.
Okay, so Gabriel going down to Temple.
Would you like me to put a mask on?
No, that's He liked the rabbi because when he got sick, the rabbi was sick and soup, so his wife had made him so he kind of realized so he went to class. And someone would answer and he would say, no, wrong. There was one right answer. It stalled him. He was so indignant between Reform Judaism and Chicago. How could there be one right answer?
Especially at the University of Chicago.
You know? And those are all the students who came
You're
to
going to
that
be
Chabad
in
class.
Michigan,
But
and you're going to be in Boston.
$500 is a
Well,
lot when he was in
Did
college.
he finish it?
He finished it.
Did he? And so the rabbi in the first class said no, and how, was it the same throughout the?
Yes, it was.
Did he think he learned something? Was it a good experience for him?
It was a bad experience.
But he stuck it out.
Well, I wasn't going to give him $500.
That's right. And so I think that was
For ambivalence.
And so when they look at the list of for the Orthodox, it's number one. You know?
Did you get it?
There is a use for it, though, isn't there, as long as it is in
No, I don't think
context?
so.
I mean,
I
well,
don't think she's real sick.
this is a candidate for the best
But I
answer.
heard the rabbi
Oh,
said
yeah. I mean, even in philosophy courses, there are certainly better answers than others, you know, it's not a free-for-all, right? But,
Oh,
to be
he's all over the
so
place.
strict about that and turn off all these eager minds, it seems that even if that was his goal,
Oh, yeah,
the
yeah.
way he did it could have been
That's
better to
right.
kind of bring him to the, you know, to bring him to the right answer, you know?
No, I'm
I
going.
wonder, especially at the University of Chicago, where on the one hand, on the other hand, this sort of thing, there might be something refreshing or even seductive about the idea of the right answer.
Yes.
Just as a kind of a compliment against this background of we don't have any answers, we just have questions. So maybe the rabbi felt not only was he offering another way, but maybe even a way that comforts.
Oh, you were so generous.
You were so full of it.
Why not both? Why not both?
You're both right.
Yeah, I'm not dogmatic about this. You're both right. Yeah, but there is something, I mean, I would probably have my limit as well. But just to see what that looks like, that approach, and especially to dare to do it on a campus like Chicago.
Yeah.
I mean, if there's ever a place where certitude goes to die, it's
That's right, but he had no choice because, no, not here, but the rabbi had no choice, because that's the way they had to do things.
Right. That's an interesting question, actually. You wonder whether or not there was another side to him, and he recognized nuance and so on. Or this was really up and down him.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
We'll never know.
And does a movement send a rabbi to a place like Chicago with no interest at all in the culture of the area of Chicago?
Take a look out behind you.
So
That's great.
different rabbis.
If y'all want to take
San
some home, because I'm going to get rid of all that stuff. So
Hold
take
on,
whatever you
don't-
want.
Do they select?
Don't take
Like everything, take whatever.
You start at Chicago, and if you survive it, then you get Iowa.
Then you get what? I didn't hear.
If you get,
You can tell me.
yeah, start at Chicago.
Yeah.
If you survive it, you get to go to a place where conformity is the order of the day. He says this is it, and everybody says amen. That's funny. Yeah.
On the trivial pursuit issues, when you talk about there must be a man named Homer, but I'm not sure there is. Homer Caspi, Israeli basketball player
Oh.
for our Cleveland Cavaliers
Oh,
at one point.
Oh, very
And
nice.
I didn't know whether to bring it up, I figured it was too irrelevant. Oh, and thank you for letting me steal the show.
Oh.
It has always bothered me,
Yeah.
the question about canon law.
Yeah, no, it's
So,
a
thank
good
you.
question, it's relevant to our discussion. I just wish I knew a little more about canon law. If Doris were here, she could say something about it.
I make it for bringing.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
I love home.
I just have a quickie, I sent you an email, you probably haven't gotten to it. Do you have any notion how long our seniors have been in business?
Oh! How long have you been with us?
Oh, 8 years.
8 years.
Then it was the wax mills for a short period of time.
Before you?
Yeah. Just for a couple of years.
So that's like 12 years.
What about this lady who did it before?
You should take some home for yourself.
Well, we
Thank
could.
you.
So the question is, if we don't know on which side of not knowing are we going to go? I say we go toward exaggeration.
Absolutely. 5,000.
That's right. This is 5783, certainly since 5,740.
Right.
Yeah, so you're pointing out the possibility that it was 12 years, 13 years.
Had she done it for a short period of time or a long period of time?
Who remembers? You've been, what did you say, 8?
We took over in 14.
Okay, so, and the Waxmans before, it seems to me there was somebody else with them. They must have done it 3, 4 years. Now we're at 12. And who did you say was before the Waxmans?
Evelyn, was that her name?
Evelyn Krim, yeah. Maybe 15 years. Seems like a little too long, but why not? We don't know for sure. Cindy would probably know, by the way.
Right.
By the way, between Cindy and me, we know the answer to all
Every
questions.
question.
I know 10% of it.
Right.
She knows 90.
I know the extension number of her. The most important
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
When you lose that,
Oh, I have told Cindy over the years, you retire, I'm gone.
and it was an offshoot of the, did it grow out of the high lifers?
Which at that point was known as the seniors.
Right. I mean, I'm trying to think of something, you know, we're gonna write up this little description.
You know, these are good questions. I'm sure Cindy has something to say about all of it.
All right, maybe I'll call her on
What was
Tuesday.
its origin?
Or, no, there is no Tuesday. There's no Tuesday either.
Well, that's a good point. I think we're open Tuesday until noon.
Until noon.
I think you'd get her. But in any event, leave a message
Yeah.
on her voicemail and she'll get back to you.
Right. Okay, and is it fair to say that in the description of the seniors that it is funded by you? I mean,
I wouldn't do that.
Okay.
No.
All right.
No, I mean, I've talked to them in the office over the years about taking it on. And their answer is we don't have the budget, but secretly they know that I've got a lot of money.
Right.
So, and then and it's fine with me.
Right.
You know?
So what do you think they're gonna do in another 80 years when you retire?
Yeah, well, look, they won't be around.
Right.
106, happy 160th.
Right.
Aren't you already to retire yet? Yeah, no, I wouldn't mention that at all.
150 and going strong. As
And don't
long as they
mention-
don't stop making the pens, I can stand up there forever, right?
Exactly, right. Yeah, how about the Guardians? I mean,
Yeah, wow, isn't that something?
exciting.
Yeah.
We'll take a big one for lunch.
All right, well.
I mean, and they're just like, momentum is building at that point, just.
And you know, if I can, I watch from the beginning. If I can't, I'm okay with it.
Yeah.
Because not until the 7th or 8th inning do they come alive.
Exactly, right.
Juan gets that hit, he says, well, here they go.
Right.
And it is pretty amazing. I mean, Francona has really generated and you remember that time a month ago or so when he argued strenuously with the umpire? And I have thought that some of it was just to get them
Right.
done. You agree with that?
Yeah.
He's fighting for us, we're gonna fight for him.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Like Lou Canella.
Oh, that's true. Oh, what was the guy's name? It was the manager of the Earl, Baltimore. Earl, you remember who I'm talking
Yeah.
about?
Earl Weaver.
Earl Weaver.
Yeah.
Yeah, how could you forget?
How could I forget from what's happened?
Did you have a bar mitzvah?